Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Dixon, and I'm the principal of Green Templeton College here at the University of Oxford. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Richard Normann Lecture. Tonight's lecture would have been given in person and a series of events held at the college to mark the event. Sadly, this cannot be this year, but the benefit of an online event is no restriction on the size of audience. So I'm really pleased to see just how many people are watching the event tonight. So to explain the background to the Richard Normann Lectures and to introduce tonight's speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Rafael Ramirez, Director of the Oxford Scenarios Programme, Professor of Practice at the Side Business School, and Governing Body Fellow of Green Templeton College. So over to you, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Michael. It is my pleasure to introduce the speaker of this year, Professor Jean Bartunek. I'll talk to her about her in a second. As you said, I'm a professor of practice here at the Business School and a fellow of Green Templeton College. Before coming to Oxford in 2003, I worked for 18 years with Richard Normann. And we have this annual lecture at the college, co-sponsored with NormannPartners, which Ulf Mannervik and myself, together with Richard and two other people, co-founded in 2003. And it does a lot of very interesting advisory and consulting work with all kinds of organizations around the world that manifests the writing of Richard. Richard became well known in management with a book at the center bottom of this picture, Management for Growth, which was a title he was never happy about. It was a translation from his Swedish mother tongue, which should have been more like Governance for Growth or Leadership for Growth, but it appeared as Management for Growth. He wrote a paper about this in Administrative Science Quarterly when he was at Harvard as a visitor. And he left the Scandinavian Institute of Administrative Research, which was his home, to create Service Management Group in 1980. And Service Management, the bottom left of these books here, became the book on how to manage services. He was involved famously with SAS in the creation of business class. And when I met him in 1985, I was still a doctoral student at Wharton. And I joined the firm as a research person. I eventually became partner. We wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review, which became this book, Designing Interactive Strategy, in the center top. He then worked with Solveig Wikström in developing this knowledge and value book on the right, which I know Jean will talk about in her talk. And his sort of memory of everything he had done in business came out as Reframing Business, again by Wiley, with a foreword by Henry Mintzberg. It's not a very easy book to read, but it's a fantastic book. And my colleague Ulf Mannervik, who's an associate fellow in the business school and who will join Jean and I in the panel after Jean's talk, uses that book as the core book to teach strategy in the Gothenburg Business School. Richard was a reflective practitioner, very much like all of the graduate students that come to our college, and both a scholar and a practitioner. And he thought of himself as clinical practitioner. This year, we have the great luck to have Jean Bartunek as our lecturer. Jean has written a very wide set of papers and books, and I selected these 6 here because it shows the breadth of her writing and the courage she has in tackling difficult subjects, such as the lessons that the Catholic Church ought to have learned from the abuse of youngsters by priests in this book at the bottom, which she co-edited. She has worked on other difficult things like uncovering disputes and conflict in an organization. If she had been here in Oxford, she would have had plenty of potential disputes between colleges and departments and so on to study. Jean is very well known to those of us in management. She has held all of the sort of senior positions that young scholars dream about holding in the Academy of Management, as editor, as a leader in the field, as a mentor to many young scholars. She's a wonderful colleague, and we're really, really lucky to have her. Very welcome, Jean, from Boston. At least you did not have the jet lag coming in and having to negotiate Heathrow. We're very sorry that we cannot offer you, as Michael said, one of the wonderful dinners that the college offers, but we will take it upon ourselves to make sure that next time you come to the UK, you are treated as we like to treat our lecturers.
I'm very grateful to have the chance to be here today. I wish here could actually be with all of you, but no such luck about that, unfortunately. And I do look forward to coming sometime and having a chance to meet several of you in person. I would like to say that from what I've read about Green Templeton College and the fact that it is a meeting point of practitioners, professional and academic worlds, I'm particularly grateful to have the chance to be with several people from this college and others. And I want to say also that I really wish that I had had a chance to get to know Richard Normann. I hadn't been familiar with his work before, but because of this invitation, I've read a lot of it. And I've been really struck with how creative he was and how much his creativity endures today in NormannPartners. So here's how we're going to start. The current president of the United States, Donald Trump, was hospitalized on October 9th for COVID, just as the current Prime Minister of the UK had been before him. On Sunday morning, October 11th, at a time when I happened to be and turned on the TV, the doctors gave an update on his health. And here are some of the things they said. There were 2 occasions on Friday when his blood oxygen levels dropped once to 93%, but he was given dexamethasone and his blood oxygen was normal on Sunday. His cardiac, kidney, and liver functions are all normal. He received a special antibody therapy directed against the coronavirus, and he received his first dose of remdesivir, and we're going to continue a 5-day course for that. So I was watching, and I figured, well, gee, this all sounds kind of normal, like he's not that sick. So one of the things I'd just like you to reflect on for 1 second is, how do you interpret this? What would you all hear from this announcement? So I was curious as to how a couple newspapers would interpret what the doctors had said. And so I looked at the New York Times, and again, this is an abbreviation, but it was clear that it was saying that, gee, he has a pretty severe case of COVID. And they wouldn't be treating him this way if he didn't have a severe case. And they're sort of keeping it a secret that it's a severe case. So then I decided to see what the New York Daily Post, which has a distinctly different political perspective than the New York Times, would say. And what they said was, his oxygen levels at one point dipped to 93%. The term dipped is different. They focus on the fact that the experimental drug hasn't caused any side effects in the president. And the fact of the matter is he's doing really well. So these two interpretations gave me completely different perspectives on what was going on for the president. And one of the things they did for me was confirm my prejudices that whatever newspapers or somebody like that is translating what happens from scholarship, that you have to be really careful in what you read because you can't really trust them. So the question it raised was, did the two news reports add to or detract from the doctor's announcement? And that's actually not so simple a question as I've just suggested. And I would imagine that you all have some perspective on this. Okay, so let's get to my presentation. This is the outline. I'm going to give some background for what I'll be talking about. I'll talk some about how management scholarship is translated for practice, some of Richard Normann's ideas that are pertinent to this, some of my current research that I'm doing with Isabel Wren regarding this kind of translation of academic research for practice, some reimagining of relationships within translation processes based on Richard Normann's work, and conclude with an invitation to you. So some background. Here's any debate has to start with an opening argument. So I'll start with the opening argument that there's a large gap or divide between academics and practitioners. I'm sure you all have heard it. And there are multiple dimensions of it, like the logics we operate out of are very different, that academic language is pathetic for practitioners, that the timescales are different, and so forth. There is a debatable response to this, which says that Richard Normann and others said that it doesn't have to be that way. And here are some of the ways it's not that way. There is a fair amount of collaborative research that involves both academics and practitioners. Some of you are probably familiar with Mode 2 that was developed in the UK. I know Andy Vandeven gave this talk last year, and he developed notions of engaged scholarship that involve academics and practitioners. My book on insider-outsider team research is another example of that. There's also a fair amount of literature on and examples of evidence-based management, which has to do with how managers can take ideas from academic sources and put them together with their own knowledge and use them to manage better. And that in the UK, particular, that's been developed in particular by David Tranfield and David Denyer, and there are others in the US and Europe too. An emphasis on relationships between academics and practitioners in which they maybe collaborate on joint projects. One particularly salient example of that is the Network for Business Sustainability that operates out of Canada, but is in many countries. And then what strikes me as an overwhelming emphasis on the impact of scholarly work on practice. It's not relational, it's not collaborative, it's scholarly work impacting practice, which is the major way, to my mind, this is being discussed now, perhaps in the United Kingdom in particular, because of the emphasis on impact as part of the research excellence framework. That's going to be the focus. So within discussions of impact, there is a focus on how do academic findings get translated for managers, consultants, and other practitioners. What does this mean to translate? And there are actually multiple examples of such translation going on. I don't know how familiar you are with all, but I'm just going to give a few just to give you some sense of it. There's a website called Impact Science, which says, if a researcher makes a discovery and no one hears about it, can it truly improve human life? The strategic communication and amplification brand of Cactus Communications, Impact Science was conceived to provide author-centric bespoke services to enhance research impact. And it also talks about, one of the things it does is repurposes and markets traditionally published scientific content to niche and lay audiences. There are other examples as well. Behavioral science and policy is a global community of public and private sector decision makers, behavioral science researchers, and so forth, with a bold mission to promote the application of rigorous behavioral science research that serves the public interest. And it does this in part through a peer-reviewed journal featuring short, accessible articles. Entrepreneur and Innovation Exchange is a social media platform whose goal is to dramatically improve the success of new business ventures. It features research articles on entrepreneurship by academia's foremost professors and other experts, as well as illuminating video interviews with and articles by some of America's most successful entrepreneurs. And the articles by academics are all translated. There are some business school publications. I have no idea what all of them are in the UK, but one of them is certainly University of Warwick, which publishes Core Insights, which, as the university says, it shows how our cutting edge research in behavioral science applies in the real world. One example from the US, of which there are many, is Knowledge at Wharton, which is the online business analysis journal of the Wharton School. The site, which is free, captures relevant knowledge generated at Wharton and beyond, with articles, podcasts, and videos based on research. And this work is published in multiple languages, including Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, Indian, and Arabic, and some high school editions. So I don't know how many of these there are in the UK or wherever you might be. There are several in the US. And as you can see, they used to be just print media. Now they're also in podcasts and several other forms. Another example, the Academy of Management, which is my major professional association, publishes Academy of Management Insights. It's an online magazine for managers and business leaders that brings the best academic research findings to managers and business leaders worldwide. Our get right to the point format transforms peer-reviewed management research from the world's top scholars into actionable evidence for the workplace. It provides easy-to-read summaries of AOM journal articles and engaging infographics and videos. And finally, one last example. There's something been developed recently called The Conversation, which is in many different countries, and I've shown here, you probably can't see it too well, but this is the United Kingdom version. It's an independent source of news and views sourced from the academic and research community and delivered direct to the public. Our team of professional editors works with university and research institute experts to unlock their knowledge for use by the wider public. So this is actually really interesting. There are all these groups that are trying to do something with academic knowledge to make it usable by people. And this is just a sample of a couple of the articles. It's beyond business. I now seem to be getting emails from them every single day with their latest ideas. So this does beg the question of what's actually going on? Who are all these people who are repurposing articles, who are making them available in an easy to read format, who are enabling them to affect policy and all that stuff. What is this process? And here's an example. This is from the Academy of Management Insights. The article is called "The Mixed Blessing of Leaders' Sense of Humor, Examining Costs and Benefits." It gets translated title-wise into "Leaders' Jokes Can Have Serious Consequences." And incidentally, anybody who isn't a full-fledged academic, you're supposed to be reading this and it's supposed to be having an impact on you. So I certainly hope that it is. Or consider this example. Bored by interest, how intrinsic motivation in one task can reduce performance in other tasks gets translated into fun tasks may drain performance in other work, along with an accompanying picture. So this article is also supposed to have an impact on you. In fact, what kind of impact is it supposed to have? I can tell you one thing that you are absolutely supposed to do. You're supposed to click on a link. At the very minimum, you're supposed to click on a link that says, yes, I really like this article. If you're in the UK and you're really desperate for a good impact score on the REF, then it would also be helpful if somebody writes somebody using company stationery writes a thank you note to the author of the article for saying this helped me tremendously. Switch gears now. Some of Richard Normann's ideas that are pertinent to translation. And I will leave them at this point just in his terminology, then I'll switch it to what I'm talking about. He says, successful companies don't just add value, they reinvent and transform value. And he has this interesting idea that fewer and fewer customers want to be passive recipients of something prepackaged for them by a supplier who knows exactly what they want. How do successful companies do this? They do it by altering a value creating system so that multiple parties are adding value to a process. Value is involved in the complex web of relationships between suppliers and customers and constructed there. It isn't just the supplier passes on value to the customer. Thus, the created value is better understood as an offer rather than as a product. An offering is an artifact designed to more effectively enable and organize value co-production. And finally, then, value chains are replaced by value constellations, in which there's a complex sharing of interrelationships of value. What happens if we look at this idea in terms of academic practitioner translation? So I want to do this by taking figure 15 from the Wickstrom and Normann book and seeing what he says there in this figure. Starts with the company has its own value star. It has its own product, let's say. This product in some way is translated into something that is of benefit to a consumer. What he's saying basically is that the relationship among these processes is much more complex than people who just present it as something linear say. So let's imagine this as academic articles, which are academics' products. In the translation process, they undergo multiple processes. Productive processes refer to customer adapted knowledge. Representative processes refer to processes in the company by which the knowledge is conveyed. And generative processes are the activities that are geared to solving problems. So all of these, according to the figure, are going on at once in production. And then this goes to the recipients of translation. So, okay, so if you're looking at this, I'm sure you're saying, yeah, this is a really vague and abstract and academic figure, so let's get to the real world. And I wouldn't blame you for thinking that. So let's talk about some work I'm involved in with Isabel. What's expected of translators? And expected is kind of a loaded term here. That they're supposed to be faithful to the main points of the original article. And in medicine, and that comes about because in medicine, there are a lot of problems that have been caused by news media saying something like this drug is 3 times as effective as this other drug, but that means it's 3,000% likely to be effective as opposed to 1,000%. So it gives all kinds of misleading information. And as I mentioned in that opening example, what did it mean? What would it have meant to be faithful to the main points of what the doctors were saying about the present? So in other words, it's not expected the translators add much value to an academic article, but they can sure reduce it. Let's take that as the starting point. So Isabel and I are studying translation processes in which the academic articles are being converted to research highlights for practitioners to read. And we're studying these in 3 different settings, none of which are included in the examples that I gave earlier. So it's none of those that I talked about earlier. One is a professional association. One is a business school magazine, a magazine published by a particular business school within a university, and a university center that has a particular focus that, as part of its work, writes short précis of some academic articles for its member companies. Here are the questions that we've been raising about what's going on. Who are the translators? What are the characteristics of the articles they choose for translation? And what happens in the process of translating? So, who's doing the translating? One of the things we've become aware of is it isn't just one set of people. There are all kinds of people in different settings doing translating. Some of them are professors and doctoral students who are trying to translate scholarly articles for practice. Some of them are professional journalists. I put here employed by a particular organization. It might be a university, or it might be the folks at The Conversation, for example, that have their own organization. Or it might be staff members that don't have any particular journalistic background at all and may have bachelor's degrees at the most, not necessarily in the area of the translation. Not all articles have an equal chance of being translated. What we found is that there are usually several criteria that are used. One is that the articles have to be published in highly rated academic journals or written by high status scholars. If that doesn't happen, an article is much less likely to be chosen. Second, they have to be written by the business school's own faculty. So I would assume, for example, that Core Insights articles mostly come from faculty at Warwick. Third, as in the case of the center, there's a list of acceptable peer-reviewed journals, but the center wants to know what's going on now in the world, so they need to have empirical data that have been collected recently. That's sometimes, as you know, a challenge for academic articles. And it's also the case that sometimes when those translating work really hard on making an article fit for practice, they just can't do it. They're just impossible. And translators also have opinions about the articles that they're translating. That should be clear. They're not just sit there being autonomous doing the translating. So here's an example. Sometimes the research feels like it's just a project that a graduate student made up because they had to publish something. you know, let's call 100 people and ask them if they like blue or white. You're concluding that because you found this, therefore it's applicable to business in this way. I actually challenge that with, I just don't think you can say that, nor did the data really say that. Or a second one, often the professors will qualify literally every sentence of the story, and that's technically precise. But from a storytelling point of view, it makes the writer look incredibly wishy-washy and uncertain. You know, like, if this is barely true, why are you telling me this? Get back to me when you know what you're saying. Or occasionally they have a positive reaction. So when I get one that's, I think, well written, it's like, this is great. This guy took something really complicated, gave me the complicated stuff, but he still then wrote just an explanation of it anybody could pick up. So these folks are having reactions to what they're doing. And the theory that Isabel and I are using to explore this is accommodation theory, which is a communication-based theory that we're adapting from another setting. But basically what it says is that the translators are in the middle of trying to write something that practitioners will understand, and also figuring out how do we maintain what the academic's voice was and precision was. And that, so that basically this is not just a straightforward, let me add this component task. It's often a very complex task that comes with its own tensions. Oh, sorry. I forgot to include this. So this, you know, how do we write what someone will understand, and how do we maintain the original voice? So here's an example of some of the reasoning that might be going on. For the parts that we think readers won't understand, we just don't include them. But for their logical reasoning part that gives the structure, we keep it, but we also simplify it. Some people like to water down the complexity of scientific studies to make it palatable and less imitating, but adding sugar to the medicine steals the integrity of the scientific process. So this is the dilemma. They are constantly thinking, how do we put these two things together? So these are just a few quick examples. What language translators use, they often replace the use of research jargon. If the source article talks about occupy domestic space, they may translate it to expand nationally. If the source says longer term orientations, they might translate it to a longer view. They increase the use of prescriptive language. The source says autonomy delegation to foreign subsidiaries, an enabling mechanism for emerging market multinationals. The translation is multinationals should delegate more to foreign subsidiaries. The source says how corporate social responsibility engagement strategy moderates the CSR financial performance relationship. They translate it to corporate citizenship strategy must be chosen carefully to maximize benefit. So it's much more, this is what you ought to do. They also appeal more to readers' emotions. The source title is External Corporate Governance and Financial Fraud, Cognitive Evaluation Theory Insights on Agency Theory Prescriptions. Gets translated, you're not the boss of me. Strong external governance makes top managers more prone to cheat. Or the title is The Effects of Leader Negative Emotions on Evaluation of Leadership in a Crisis Situation, the Role of Anger and Sadness. Translation, big boys and girls do cry. The outside perception of leaders is influenced by the emotions they display. So you can get some sense of the difference there between the language that's much designed to appeal to somebody who they have to persuade to be interested in this topic and interested in how it can help them. So let's just do a brief return to Richard Normann's work. Is the web of relationships, including both the academic and author and translator, generating something or anything of value to the academic article? I told you earlier, my disposition is to think this cannot possibly add value. At worst, at best, it won't detract from it. But reading his work, I'm having to rethink this, or rethink at least the possibilities that maybe if in a research translation or research highlights, you find something of value, maybe it was the academic and the translator together who helped create that. Is that even possible? Or let's take another example from Richard Normann's work. Consider a Swedish laundry. I mean, why not? This is an industrial laundry in Sweden. You and I may not think of laundries as sources of innovation, but we might as well. So with 22,000 customers in the Swedish market alone, the laundry is, or at least was when the book was published, the leader in its industry, and Volvo is its biggest customer. When Volvo embarked on a course of general efficiency improvement, they also called for a rationalization of the order routines operation. That was going to be very complex. They had to simplify the flow of information. Every employee had to get clothes that fit them within 24 hours, no errors in deliveries and so forth. This was a challenge for the laundry, but the laundry accepted the challenge as long as Volvo would be involved. And Volvo said they would. And because some of the things that Volvo wanted were not just the laundry's responsibility, they were part of Volvo's as well. So without going into detail of all the changes, as a result of their cooperative effort, the work they did together led to a new laundry system that increased the value for both Volvo and the laundry. It made both parties much more knowledgeable. For example, it turned out that what Volvo was saying originally that it most wanted in terms of ordering routines wasn't really what they wanted, but they didn't know that, and they weren't able to articulate that until they started working on what they thought they wanted. So it was in the interaction that the knowledge got better for both parties. So can a relationship between Volvo and an industrial laundry serve as a model for what we're talking about? I mean, why not? And since I'm an academic, using the language of one of the translators earlier, I get to ask a wishy-washy question. When and how can or do translators, in tandem with academics, add value to, not detract value from scholarly articles? For example, for both academics and somebody who is an academic, did the language use in the translations appeal to you or offend you? How can or should we reimagine the relationship between academics and translators? Should I consider the possibility that translators might actually say something intelligent and helpful? And more, when should this relationship be taking place? If I'm going to have somebody translate my work, should we wait until it's time to repurpose the articles in a language that Insight Science gives? Should the translator's translation processes be unidirectional from the academic to the audience? Might consumers play a role? And what kind of contacts or contracts should there be between academics and practitioners? Actually, even the idea that there could be one is sort of radical. Really, what would Richard Normann do in this case? Addressing these issues require acknowledging that translation processes isn't anywhere near as straightforward a value chain as is commonly assumed, including by all the people making money out of translating articles. And it also requires trying to imagine what a much more complex value constellation of academic translation processes might mean. It also suggests another question. With all these articles, can all the consumers of translations add value to both the translation process and academic research? And just so it's clear, I'm addressing this question to everybody here who reads research translations, and yes, that means you too. Unfortunately, I can't see any of you, but I'm sure I'm speaking to each of you. And I just want to admit that the idea that I'm even talking like this is all Richard Normann's fault. This is a completely heretical question from the perspective of most academic work. So really don't blame me for asking it. It's all his fault, but nevertheless, here we are. So in the spirit of an offering rather than a finished product, I'm going to end this talk with an invitation to you. To anybody who consumes translations of academic articles. Should you be more than passive recipients of the articles? Should you ever do something more than click on the article or write a thank you note so the university gets a higher impact score? Can you imagine yourselves adding value to translations, adding value to translation processes, adding value to relationships with academics, and adding value to relationships with translators? And I want to stop with that, with those questions asked, as a way of engaging you all in a value constellation process. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jean, for a very interesting talk. We're going to have about 15 minutes of a panel. This is for everybody. And then we will have Q&A directly with Jean. You have two functions at the bottom of your Zoom call. One is Q&A. If you want questions to Jean or to the panel, send them through Q&A. And if you want to chat among yourselves, please feel free to do that. So if you have questions for Jean, please put them in Q&A and for the panel. And if you want to talk with each other on chat, you're very welcome to do that. The panel here is Jean, whom you've met, professor in Boston College, Ulf Mannerik, my colleague in both the Said Business School and in NormannPartners, who co-founded NormannPartners with Richard Normann and myself and two others in 2003, who's a very good reflective practitioner, and myself chairing it. Ulf, I'm going to start with you, as you are more of a consumer than a producer, although you have written books with me and articles as well. So you sometimes are a producer, but on balance, you're more of a consumer and an interpreter and translator of insights working with your clients. How would you answer Jean's question about WWR&D? What would Richard Normann do?
That's a great question, and thanks for putting it forward, and thank you, Jean, for the lecture and speech here. I think that a core notion of Richard's was this notion that the value is created in use. With you bringing up this notion of what can the role of the translator be, you can bring that even further into considering not only what role can the reader or the user of that piece of news or the translated article bring back to the academic, but what is the actual value that the article is going to create there, and what system is that information taking place in? So he will look at it from that perspective in terms of the value that the article can produce in the setting there. And that is a challenge, I think, that I perceive as when writing, but also when consuming articles, when I find myself in the practice where lots of knowledge is created, of course, and that is complemented by what is created in the academic setting. So I think there's this challenge there, not only of translating into the reader's context, but also understanding how it complements the already existing context of knowledge that and the challenges that the practitioner is standing with. So that's one of the reflections that I have from the presentation that you just made.
Thank you, Ulf. We have a question, Jean, that's related to this. Why are you and Isabel talking about translators rather than interpreters? Why the metaphor of translation rather than interpretation or guidance or something else?
That's a great question. And the reason we are is that that's the language that they use. That they define themselves as, that most of the people we talk with define themselves as translators. However, I totally agree with you that it's impossible to translate without also interpreting. That's something anybody translating from one language to another learns very quickly. But it's also, well, this is actually from one language to another too. It's not as dramatic as from Swedish to English or something like that, but it definitely requires some interpretation.
Yeah, so there's a question here from Kieran in Holland saying that he's puzzled that the desire of the translators is to reflect exactly the original. He says he's read many translated books and policy papers where a good translator will often reframe the original to better communicate the underlying idea. For example, by changing the metaphor. His question is, are translators between academia and practice also in the reframing business or not? That doesn't, for at least for those we've studied, that probably is true, but it's not the language used. And in the situations, in many situations, well, there's a whole journal called Implementation Science. A lot of that has to do with medical knowledge. And the problem is when it comes to actual prescriptions or judging the quality of something, if you say something that's really misleading, that's a problem. If you say as a prescription, you should carry out this particular intervention, or you should take this pill, or you should do this exercise because it's going to lead to success, usually the article is not as blunt in saying, this is going to work, period, or this isn't going to work. There's much more caution about what's going to happen. So the problem can come in when the assumption is given that if you do this, it's going to work, period.
And if it doesn't work, blame the people who did the original research. And I think often that something metaphorical or reframing can work for giving some types of ideas about new ways of thinking about things. And if that's the case, then giving a new idea is great. But let me make one distinction that Donald Peltz made long ago. He said, when you're trying to translate an idea into practice, you could be doing three types of things. One is you could be saying, this is what you should do. So this is how you implement this idea. The second one is we could use this idea to challenge you and get you to think more broadly. And the third is you could use this as a symbolic justification for your own way of thinking in the first place. If what's supposed to come out is a prescription that says, this is what you should do, which many people want, then it's really crucial that it be precise. If what's really coming out is, let's use this to expand your own way of thinking about something, then often reframing it or using a different metaphor might be very helpful. Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yes, it does. I want to, before directing all of the questions to you, I want to say something about the what would Richard Normann do from my point of view, and I would like to see if Ulf agrees as well. I think Richard would invite you, Jean, and your colleague Isabel to do the following. First of all, to do a map of how things are in knowledge at Wharton, where I published. It's my alma mater for my doctorate. How do they map things in terms of their role, the role of the academics, the role of their intended users, and so on. But he would always look at this, not the way you have done alone. He would look at the multiple roles that each of these parties play. So in addition to translators, they might be legitimators, or they might be insurers of the next round of grants coming to that academic.
Right.
It's a number of roles that these middle people play. I was surprised that you did not put practitioner journals in there, like Harvard Business Review or Sloan Management Review or California Management Review, that are supposed to be one of these bridges. So he would first of all map the territory and look at the multiple roles that there are among them. And he would put them in a triangle where the three parties, the reader, the writer, and the translator, if we put that, what do they do in relation to each other? Then he would look at invaders. He would look at who's invading this territory. And there's a book in Swedish called The Innovator's Dance, which was never translated into English. But I did discuss my Swedish is even rustier than it used to be. But Ulf, I'm sure, has read that book very well. And what he would look at is who's invading this territory. Perhaps the conversation as a recent arrival is an invader. And why did they invade the territory? What do they bring to the situation as well? And then he would move into designing a better system. I know that you have been a critical person of the research excellence framework used in this country in terms of the impact score, which went from 20% to 25%. As a way of assessing if my research as an academic is very good or not good enough. And so he would also look at the institutional setup in which these things work. Do they work the same way in China? Then they work in medicine, then they work in engineering, then they work in law, then they work in management, and then he would compare these things. Ulf, tell us a bit about how you work on that when you work with real cases.
No, just building further on that. I mean, that's a great idea to look at how you can explore and move further with some of these ideas. I mean, from the perspective of the practice that Richard was in, I think that what you would add into that as well is the possibility of using analogies to sort of look at how you can redesign that system. So think about other types of roles, other types of systems. Can you impose that on that, the model of that into that system? And look, if we would carry the model of a quite different business model, if you translate it into that system, would it improve the value? Would it change what values are created for the academic and for the reader or consumer, and for the translator in that system as well?
And how would you start doing that, Ulf?
Sorry?
How would you start doing that in an actual engagement? How would you go and do that?
Now we're getting into design process around that, but that's an excellent approach to what Rafael is talking about, mapping up that system first, and then looking at what are the kinds of pressure points that you have on that system. So are there some of these roles or some of those values enabled? And it's not in the notion of what is value as the sort of the result of the historical activities of writing the article that moves through the process, but what is it that you can do with that? And what is enabled for the different parties in that? And what are the factors imposing a pressure on the system that makes some values more critical, or that shows you that there are some choke points in the system? And based on that, can you attend to the critical values in a better way? And are there examples from other settings, other applications, or other indices, which would be the business application in it, that you can lend ideas from and they can translate into that setting? And where you can look at, can you organize that system in more effectively? Based on that, you would start to look at, if that's a more ideal system, how do I make it happen? So how do I start? What's a stepping stone to try to realize that more active role that creates better value for the writer, for the translator, for the reader? And can I find a stepping stone approach to realizing that? And as you do that, of course, just as with in the original notion that you have the translator and they start to translate, they will start to change the content as well. The system will start to change over time, and that becomes a process of change, of course, as well.
I don't want to respond to everything you're saying, because you're raising really important questions, and I'm glad this is going to be recorded so I can share it with Isabel. But let me just respond one thing very specifically. Raphael, we didn't include things like Harvard Business Review because those articles are often primarily written by the academic, not just translated, with the help of a lot of translation, but it's still under the academic's name. And we were just trying to use examples where it wasn't under the academic's name. And both, I think, actually, you and Raphael both, what I was saying from many perspectives would be totally radical. What you're doing is making it even more radical. So I just want to mention that. I think what you're saying is that once somebody starts getting some ideas along these lines, that the possibilities increase gigantically. So it's quite fascinating, actually.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I take from Ulf's response is that the invitation to you and Isabel is to escape from just the prison of accommodation theory and bring in other theoretical lenses such as design theory or co-production theory or mapping theories to contrast that particular lens that you have been using. Because maybe the lens of accommodation is imprisoning the possibilities of understanding what's really going on that a multi-lens perspective would bring to that. Your edited books are wonderful examples of your inviting in multiple perspectives on a particular issue. And I would think that an edited volume on this with multiple perspectives would be equally valuable in that mode. There's a number of questions here. The first one that I want to bring to you, we have 25 minutes. I'm encouraging people on the call to please put any questions you have for Jean. And if you want to ask questions for Ulf or myself, that's okay. But Jean is our keynote speaker here tonight on Q&A, and I will select the ones that this is a chairman's privilege, the ones that I find more interesting. The first question for you.
No value statement at all in which
no,
ones.
I'm reframing as somebody put it. But literally this is a question from one of the participants in the seminar. Will the translators subsume the academic role? In short, will academia as we know it now exist in 100 years?
I think I'm sure academia as we know it now won't exist in 100 years. I'm sure it'll be different in many ways that we can't imagine. But in terms of whether a translator will subsume the role, I really don't know. And I think a lot of it depends on the particular discipline and how much the translator actually knows about the discipline seriously, how much what's supposed to come out of an article is specific prescription, and how much the person who did the original research can be sued if something doesn't work. I think that will make a big difference. And
so a similar question, but on the other direction here, is from Paul in London, who says, why isn't the reader also considered a translator? If you think about the translation downstream from the original author, those that read the translations of academic articles in turn translate what they've read for colleagues in their own firms or in their own government departments. We in academia, are we treating the consumers too passively? Or should they be thought of the way Richard Normann thinks of them, as very active? So I read, Ulf is a professor in Gothenburg. He writes a paper which somebody else has translated in the conversation. I'm working in Volvo. I have to translate what I've read in the conversation for my colleagues. So I'm also in the translation business.
yes, I think that's a great question. And I think it's an unknown question, because to the best of my knowledge, the only way right now of measuring that is commonly used of whether an article has a quote impact is how often it gets clicked on. That's what the center that I mentioned uses, how many that they think that doing the work they're doing is important because their members click on the research translations a lot. They have no idea of whether it goes any further than that. And I think, I think the idea that somebody would then actually make use of that in a way that adds value is awesome. What I don't know is if that happens. I don't know if somebody reads something and then says, let me get this idea and do something new. I don't know if they just click and say, well, that's what else is new. You know, it would be great to know more about that.
Well, that does happen.
What actually happens.
That does happen in the research excellence framework impact cases. You have to provide evidence, not only that your stuff was read and clicked on, but that it actually made a difference for the reader's organization in a way that corresponds to whatever it is that your research was about. So one of our colleagues in finance, for example, could demonstrate that his research had changed the investment policy of a big Norwegian fund. Then, okay.
Yes, And my knowledge may not be totally up to date, in part because I can't go to the UK right now. But when last I left off, that latter part was most demonstrated by somebody writing a letter and saying, look what difference this made for us.
Yeah, they've wised up since then. You have to now produce evidence that what's behind the letter is real.
Well, that's great. That's great. That's beyond what I knew about. And it's also something that's not even vaguely the case in the US. There's nothing beginning to approach something like that in the US.
Good. Question from our colleague Lucy in London. Is it not the case that very soon artificial intelligence will be doing all of the translation? And what will digital platforms do to this translation business that you've been studying? Any views about how technology might transform translation?
I've seen some examples in the US where tweets have been a fairly destructive form of translation of all kinds of things. I think that it is easy for social media to be a destructive influence on translation, especially when they're brief news flashes coming with a fair amount of emotion. I think that is part of the challenge of understanding what's actually going on in the translation process. How much is somebody picking up of what really is the intent? How much is somebody automatically reacting negatively to something? The one value of accommodation theory is it makes conscious the tensions that translators are in. That it's not a simple throughput system, but they are facing multiple pressures. And hopefully, if they're intelligent, they're trying to face them honestly. But there are many people who don't do that at all, who simply just take one metaphor or something like that, or one thing that they like or don't like, and just use social media to state their opinion as loudly as they can.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions here. One relates to your Volvo example. He says, this person, if I understood that the Richard Normann Volvo and Swedish laundry case worked well because there was no translator. They worked with each other and translated each other's works directly. And so had a translator been there, is the suggestion, that intermediation would have decreased value rather than created value. And a related question here is, why are you discounting the situations where the translator is the original author? I mean, you did put the conversation as an example, where it's still the original author helped by the conversation to translate, but you excluded HBR where the same thing happens. Why would the role of, I'm doing research on X as a researcher from March to October is that, and then I work in November and December to translate it. I'm still the same person, but I have a different role. Why are you discounting that? And is it so that not having that intermediation would create more value?
Okay, first in terms of Volvo and laundry, I was thinking of the laundry as the equivalent of the translator. Oh. That as it was a relationship between these two entities. And Volvo was telling the laundry what it wanted, and the laundry had to make sense of what Volvo wanted in a way that, and the way they did that was not to say, okay, these are the things you say, we'll just do it, even though we don't have a clue what you're talking about. What they did was say, let's talk about this together and get an idea about it. I could have talked about Harvard Business Review's, the MIT Sloan Management Review, California, all of those. It's just for the study, we just didn't do that because we were trying to be clear that we were in a setting where the translator is the one who produces the final product. From my understanding of the conversation, at least when I've been on webinars that have included them, it was the translators who were producing the final product. And so I maybe have missed some things, but that was my sense of them saying, we are the ones who are going to do this for you. So I can go back and look in more detail.
Okay, Denise and Kent asks whether you would agree if part of the problem of the gap that these translators are addressing is due to the incentives in place in academia, and how would you change the incentives to align better between the academic work and the intended, not other academics, but real world people using it? What is it about the incentive system that bothers you?
Well, that is also a gigantic question. I mean, and it's one that varies greatly depending on the institution. And so I don't think it's possible to answer this for academia as a whole. There are some universities now, pardon me, most excellent universities now insist that academics publish in top-tier academic journals. And one of the reasons for that is that they will get enough of a rigorous review so somebody can verify that what they're saying is actually something trustworthy. And but there are also there are so many different directions of this question. Some universities are also now saying, what's your social, when they hire somebody, what's your social media platform? So you could be the one who is saying, this is what this article really means. And if that's the case, then there are not necessarily conflicting issues. Another way of talking about this is that there are some academics who are saying really important, making really important theoretical contributions, but it's not always immediately clear to the academic how they matter, but it may require somebody else to see how this matters. I'll give you one example. At BC the other day, I was listening to a talk by somebody in our finance department who happened to be talking about the fact that in India, in terms of loans, there are all kinds of, I'm going to simplify this, but there are all kinds of issues that have to do with prejudices and in-group, out-group dynamics and stereotyping. So what he was doing was actually referring to social science literature that is really important, much of which was developed some time ago, that required somebody from another setting to be able to say, oh, look how I can demonstrate this effect in this other setting. I've read recent articles on racial issues, some of which goes back to talking about Heider's notion of the psychology of interpersonal relations as setting the primary theoretical contribution that helps explain what's going on. And that work was done more than 50 years ago. So I think it's a false dichotomy of academics versus practice concerns. I think it's an issue of how can, especially in true conceptual contributions, how can there be joint working on exploring what those conceptual contributions might mean in practice in different settings, in widely varying settings?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna again combine a couple of questions here, which have to do with the identity of the translator. One person in Northern UK asked, is the translator sometimes a corporate employee translating whatever is being published for the benefit of their own organization? So imagine that you're working, I work in Shell, and I know for sure that some of us in the scenario team would interpret things we read for executives to be able to act on.
Of course.
Versus another view here is that the translator is part of the university, and the academics, at least in some fields, see the translators as part of their team. In our college, there's quite a few scientists in the natural sciences and many medics, and both medics and scientists create companies, sometimes with the university, sometimes without, to translate their natural science or medical science findings into corporate entities that are spun out and eventually sold to big parties. So there you would think that it is acceptable for the academic to consider the translator as part of their value creating system, whereas in the Shell sense, it's the user. And then the related question is, what are the multiple metaphors of the reader? Is the reader, quote unquote, the audience, as if you were broadcasting in the BBC? Is the reader a consumer? Is the reader a user? Is the reader a translator?
I think those are fascinating and important questions. So, what's the identity of the translator? That's interesting in itself. In part is, how does the translator see him or herself? One way of putting that, especially because, well, so in the university setting we studied, the translators were former people trained as journalists who had been hired at that particular business school to do the translation. In the first case, in the professional association, they tended to be doctoral students. They were often doctoral students who had had lives prior to going to doctoral school. And in the last case, they were just members of the setting who did this as part of their work at the setting and who didn't have any particular investment in the papers they were reading. So one of the issues that comes up here is what type of investment does the translator have in the work that they're involved with? How do they see their role? How do they see the interests that they particularly have? How do they see the interests of their employer? So I think there's a lot of variation in that. And I think that those interests can be really important in driving how somebody, what's even parts of an article stand out for somebody. And what are the multiple metaphors of the reader? I think that's a great question, and I don't know, because at least in the US, the stuff I hear is it's very little comparative expectation of the reader. And
Part of whom?
Pardon
Sorry,
me?
on the part of whom? On the part of the academic or on the part of the translator?
I think on the part of, I think on the part of the translator, I think let me go at this a different way. There's somebody named Kevin Lewis who used to write a column called Uncommon Knowledge for the Boston Globe, who now writes it called Social Science. And what he does is take very short excerpts of scholarly articles in social sciences and publishes them. It publishes a bunch of them in one issue. But I think what he tries to publish is the thing that most stands out as kind of a shock value, not something that confirms something that everybody knows. So I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think part of the expectation is that the reader needs to have something that's a bit of something new to them to even notice this. So I think the expectation of the reader is that they will be intrigued, but I don't think, at least here, that there's much done on what happens after the reader is intrigued.
Okay, so there is a related question here, which I found very interesting. If you think of the translation not as a product, but as a process,
Right.
as an iterative process, this person says social media can be constructive as well. Think of Twitter threads and discussions built around hashtags, where a wider community can engage with a practitioner in real time and in an informal or semi-formal environment. What does it mean for practitioner-translator relations to be enrolled in the wider non-institutional networks which exist on social media? Beyond the written text, increasing use of podcasts and videos for the purpose of translating research. You mentioned yourself the podcasts in Wharton, to a wider, create new opportunities for these threads. I'll give you an example. When I read the Financial Times, and there's a very interesting article, there's an even more interesting part, which is the comments of FT readers afterwards.
Yeah.
Who are interpreting in different ways what the author in the FT did. Can you think of situations that you and Isabel are studying where the translation is an ongoing translation back and forth, not only from the producer through the translator to the consumer, but back from the consumer through the translator to, I didn't quite mean that, and so on and so forth, as an iterative process?
The ones we've been studying, that doesn't exist. But I alluded earlier to the fact that there are several academic practitioner connections that are much more relational, where the Network for Business Sustainability, for example, involves academics and practitioners literally working together to construct, say, scenarios about business sustainability. There's another one that's headquartered in Boston, the Relational Coordination Roundtable, that has regular meetings of academics and practitioners meeting together to talk about issues related to relational coordination, and there are others. What I find intriguing and a little weird right now is the fact that so much of the emphasis seems to be on unidirectional impact. On how can I get me to have an impact on practice? And so the way I learned about the conversation, for example, was through being part of a impact scholar community webinar that's mostly for young scholars, that they're trying to teach people, this is how you can get your work to have an impact on practice. But that's all one directional. It's not, how can we build up relationships in which academics and practitioners collaborate? And I find that mystifying. I find it problematic, actually, that the emphasis is so on such a narrow piece of what I think would be much more useful in the long run. Okay, well, we're coming to the end of this very interesting session. I'm going to ask Ulf to close. I personally thank you very much, Jean, for making the time in these strange contexts that we're in, waiting for the election result in your country. And I'm just going to pass to Ulf to give us a vote of thanks. Thank you very much.
And yes, so thank you. We're coming to a closing here tonight, and thank you, Jean. This has been a very rich conversation and made us reflect on, and me personally also reflect on what is value in this setting here and how is value enabled in this setting here. So offering perspectives and learning for both, I hope, academia and practice on this important, challenging topic of translation and translators. In to reach out to Raphael's final comments here on the interaction between academia and practitioners as well. So I would like to thank first and foremost the 2020 Richard Normann Lecture Professor Jean Bartunek of Boston College for your generously sharing your research and perspectives with us here tonight. Then Principal Sir Michael Dixon and Green Templeton College of the University of Oxford for carrying, organizing and hosting of this event. And of course, my panelist colleague, Professor Rafael Ramirez of Green Templeton College and Said Business School in Oxford as well for carrying, mentoring of the Q&A session here. And last but not least, all of you have joined us this evening and have brought questions and further perspectives on this strategic conversation about the translations and the values and value creating processes and systems related to that. So on the behalf of NormannPartners and together with Green Templeton College, with which we organize the Richard Normann Lecture, thank you all and have a good evening and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you all.
Bye, Jean. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.